Okay, welcome to the first installment of the sound creation series that I'm starting right now. This is going to be essentially a running series I'm doing that condenses everything that I've learned from teaching for the last 10 years into an ongoing series. I'll talk about this more at the end, but essentially, I'm trying to move everything to a subscription type model. You can subscribe to my website, and through doing that, you'll be able to get access to essentially the weekly or bi-weekly installment of this, which is going to be me streaming, talking about, anything really, but starting with very foundational information, and then we're going to work our way all the way up to where all we're doing is arrangement, and I'm just going to be doing these talks, doing Q&As at the end. And then there's two subscription tiers. You can either pay to get just the recordings of these videos going forward, or you can pay the slightly higher tier and actually attend the lectures real time. But for the first one, I'm putting this out for everyone to, of course, advertise the fact that I'm doing all this stuff, but also because this is genuinely the most important stuff I know. And ultimately, if you've taken a private lesson with me anytime in the last 5 years, we've definitely talked about these things. And I think through doing this for so long, I've kind of started to actually figure out where and why people get stuck in this process and how to actually do something about it. So this is really directed at anyone at any level. I think if you're an absolute beginner, a lot of these things probably won't be relevant to you in terms of like the problematic things that start to arise usually don't happen till later in the process. But in terms of like good creative habits and perspective to have early on and to like identify these pitfalls, this is kind of the only information you need, honestly, and pretty much everything else you can learn from yourself and your own process. And I want to give as many people as I can kind of just the resources they need to do what they want creatively, like execute their ideas. Like I don't think there needs to be a barrier of technical knowledge. And while there is to some extent, I think way more what matters is like how you apply all this stuff, right? So this is the idea, SCS, sound creation seminars, that we're going to be doing this all the time in my Discord. If you subscribe on my website, you get access to all of these forever. As long as I have the energy to do it, I will still be doing it. And this is going to be my thing. Instead of doing just YouTube stuff and kind of Twitch streaming randomly, I'm going to kind of centralize everything to this, and I'll be very active in my Discord. And then going forward, I'll still be doing some free stuff for YouTube, and there will be a ton of free stuff on my site that you can get. But yeah, if you want to find this course, that's where you can do it. And with all of that said, let's dive into this. I already covered a lot of sort of this intro stuff, but if you don't know who I am, my name is Noel, and I produce under the name Frequent. I've been doing this for 15 years, teaching for 10 of those years. And again, everything we're talking about today, like I'm not even, just so you know, I'm not even opening Ableton today. Everything today is about kind of the psychological aspect of music production and kind of the way that we think about the process and how that affects what we end up actually doing. Because I think this is the stuff that YouTube tutorials in general definitely don't talk about. It's mostly just like, here's how you do this thing. So we're going to dive into this. Before we get into any of the specific things we're going to talk about, I just want to lay out this general ethos around learning and teaching that I have, which I already touched on this a bit. But the first thing is that technical skill is super overvalued by most people in production, honestly. Like I think obviously there's a lot of technical things to know, and knowing those things can be useful, but pretty much in every situation it doesn't matter what you're doing on a technical level. Like you can do very, very simple things, but the application and creative process surrounding those things is what actually matters. And I think it's really important to not lose sight of that, because we will talk about technical things in this course later down the road, but those are a means to an end, right? Like everything you learn about production is just so that you can create. And that creative energy is kind of what actually drives the whole process. And if you don't have that, like knowing more things doesn't really matter. Um, and to further that, there's too much information, man. There's just too many things to know. Like we're gonna touch on a few things throughout this where it's like you could spend an entire lifetime getting into like the physics of sound, or like different tunings and the harmonic series, or sound design itself, which is a big one. People who hit me up are very interested in knowing about sound design. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with knowing more about any of these things, but they are quite literally infinite, and you could never become an expert on everything. So, with that in mind, when we're learning things, what we want to know is just how can we use this stuff, right? Like, if I'm going to learn something about physics of sound, like it's just interesting, so that's good. But beyond that, how can I actually use it to do something? And so a lot of these sort of either very high level or very low level things that we'll be looking into throughout this that get kind of complicated, or are quote unquote technical, or whatever, however you view it. Although those things are important and we should talk about them, all we're trying to know is like, what of this is useful to me right now? And some of those things require that, yeah, you do some work and some research and some practice. But for the most part, we can kind of just borrow some very low level information about a lot of things about music production and use that to essentially inform our decision making and just experiment. Like, we don't really need to know everything. We just need to know how the tools work and how to do something with them. And from there, everything can be found through experimentation and through kind of just your own process, ultimately just making decisions and finding out for yourself what things do and how you like it, and how like you could cleverly implement all of these different tools against each other. Anyways, learn your technical knowledge, but just learn enough to wield it, and then actually spend time making music. Like, that's what this all comes back to. And I think we could spend all day in the weeds about like how to think about it or how to do technical things, but unless you're actually doing it, none of this matters. So with all of that said, the point of this course is to ultimately provide a strong foundation, both from a mental aspect and from a technical aspect, so that people who are in an earlier stage of learning music don't have to worry about what is important to know, or like if they're missing something. I want to create like a definitive resource where you have enough information. And realistically, most people who hit me up for lessons, if you're watching this right now and you know what my music is and you're interested in all this, the chances are you probably already know more than enough things about music to make whatever it is you want to make. And the barrier is likely not out of this lack of foundational skills. I obviously that I can't speak for everybody on that regard, but in a lot of cases, people think the problem is that they don't know something, when in reality, it's not really about knowing things. And we'll touch on this more, but this is the ethos. It's just be creative, realize that the information is only so important, and it's way more what you do with it. And if we start with just some good, solid technical and conceptual information, then honestly, everything else is just as hard as you make it for yourself. And making music can actually be super easy, even if you have specific goals. Like, nothing about it is as hard as it seems in almost every case. It's more of just like finding a way that you personally can execute the thing that you want. And there's no rules and no limits, so you can almost always figure it out. So anyways, with all that said, let's move on. to the first topic, which is going to be diminishing returns. Um, and I think this is a pretty intuitive idea, but if you think about when you first start at anything, like we'll take Ableton or learning production in general, like if you don't know what MIDI is and somebody teaches you, well, here you go, here's what MIDI does. It allows you to input notes and like do all these things and use a synthesizer and all like that just unlocks so many options. Like it does so much for you to know that that's a thing you can do. The return is massive for learning that one piece of information. And so we get what's called exponential returns at the beginning of any process because there's just so much. Anything you learn at all is basically useful information because you don't know anything. But as you build that knowledge base, say you learn what distortion is fundamentally, it's like, okay, that's big. But by the time you've looked at your 100th distortion VST and really picked it apart, it's like, yeah, these things all have their own character and way of like doing clever things with the distortion to make it slightly different. But at the end of the day, a distortion is a distortion is a distortion, and it all just like has the same effect but does it differently. And so learning about your 100th distortion unit really doesn't change your reality that much. And ultimately doesn't even affect the decisions you make that much, probably, unless it becomes your new favorite distortion plugin or something. But even then, it's like you're still just going to be distorting with that distortion. And so conceptually, you haven't really gained very much in terms of like new information or new ways to be creative or new ways to approach the software even. And so diminishing returns is just this idea that like as soon as you know some things, learning new things becomes less and less useful. And the problem is that you can't actually do anything about that. Like this is true in everything in life. Like the more you know about anything, the less significant a new piece of data becomes because you're just adding it to a larger data set. And realistically, like your working memory is not able to hold all of this information anyways at the same time. So it's like you may intuitively have read about 100 different distortion units. You may have even installed 100 different distortion units, but actively when you're making a song, it's like you're never going to think through the list of 100 and like understand the nuances of all of them and like really make a true decision between all of those things. It's just not feasible. So diminishing returns are inevitable, and part of any skill, it's this point where your brain is going to have to resort to one of two things. It's going to have to say, okay, we have to make a decision here, so we'll use a distortion unit. We need a distortion unit. So which one are you going to grab? You're either going to grab the one that you're the most used to grabbing, whatever's in your habitual space, or you're going to grab the one that you learned about or thought about the most recently. But neither of those two things necessarily have anything to do with the best distortion unit for this situation. It's just you're going to automate out most of that process because it's impractical to actually sort through that entire list. And this is happening on every level in every facet of production at all times. Like you can't help but learn a lot of things about this when you do it all the time for years. You know, like you'll just pick up on so many subtleties, and although you are still learning things, it's like you're also forgetting things at the same time. You're just replacing the most relevant information out of this massive data set that you don't really have access to at any given point in time. So knowing about this is really, really important early on, because at first you probably won't be that limited in learning. But I think the reason that people come to me for lessons, and a lot of the problem I mean, I've been through all of these problems as well. Like you reach this wall where everything you were doing before doesn't seem to like really add any new information. And no matter how many times you keep going back and trying to learn new things, it doesn't really seem to have much of an impact on the overall process. And this is a pattern that, you know, I've seen enough times to attribute it to diminishing returns, but this isn't the full picture. So obviously, like learning more things becomes less and less useful, but it goes much deeper than that. And this is where we're going to get into the habitual space. So sorry, we're not going to go into creative versus yeah, this is what we want. I accidentally skipped this, but that's okay. We can go in either order on diminishing returns and habit formation because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So habit formation is, again, like this is how any skill works. Like if you want to get good at something, you have to train. And so what training does is it converts any bit. So say like in production, it's like if you don't know how to do anything, you're going to have to start making some habitual decisions so that you can get through to actually making music. So, like, someone will teach you a way of making drums and say it's like, oh, yeah, you just throw some samples in a drum rack and look, now you can just like make these MIDI drums and you can draw them in and whatever. If you don't know what any of that means, doesn't matter. It's just a random example. But sure, now you have this one way of making drum samples exist in your project. And so you start using that to make songs and you move on to other things. You know, you're just making music, using other instruments, not really thinking about the drums. And like eventually you'll do this so many times where you'll be like, oh, I need drums. And you reach for the drum rack and you do the thing that you don't even have to think about it anymore. Like that you'll just automatically load those samples, drag in the drum rack, and there you go. You can start making drums and move on to the next part of the song. And so this is necessary for you to actually be able to move forward. You need to start creating habits around all of the little parts of making music that allow you to automate it, to give your brain the power to decide for you that you're gonna, you know, oh, I need drums. Well, this is how we make drums. And it's not a matter of you having to think about it and spend time clicking around trying to figure out what to do. You know exactly what to do. And you've already created a path in your mind that is automatic and you reach for the thing. The problem with this is that most of our thinking happens this way. And people, I think, kind of aren't aware of how deep, like, so there's the whole thing of you only use 10% of your brain, which is obviously not true. Like you use all of your brain, but the amount of your brain that is conscious, that is actually experience, like your inner voice, your inner monologue, the part of you that is making decisions, that is generously 10% of your brain's function. Generously, probably less than that, probably a lot less than that. And so the reality is that even though we are making conscious decisions all the time, most of what our brain is doing, we have no idea. We genuinely have no idea what our brain is doing. And most of what it's doing is regulated by habits. And you need that to live. Like, this is important. Habits are how you are able to like think about how hard it was to drive a car before you did it a billion times, and now you get in a car, you don't think about any of it. It all just happens and you react instantly to things that happen in front of you. Like, you need all of that habitual training to operate at a higher level. Like, if you have to think about like how to do every little thing in the car in order to get around, like, you're kind of a hazard, right? Because you're not thinking about what's happening on the road. You're thinking about internally, like, how do you drive a car? And the idea is you use the habit so that you aren't stuck at lower levels of thinking, and you now can think like, okay, my body's just going to drive the car essentially for me, and then I'm in my brain making decisions about whatever's happened. So like if something comes out on the road, I know I need to stop, and I like, you don't even think about it. You, like, your foot just automatically like slams on the brake before you even can consciously like comprehend what is happening. And without that, like, we're all doomed. So it's not bad that your subconscious is doing all these things for you. Like, we consciously aren't able to pay attention to many things at the same time. So like the fact that your brain is in fact paying attention to a lot of things and making a lot of decisions on your behalf constantly is a really good thing. It's why you don't have to think about digesting your food or beating your heart or breathing or any of these things. Like, your body is in many ways keeping you alive for you. And in the same way, in a lot of ways, it's making your music for you too. And the only choice you get is what you consciously train in to your subconscious. That's the only decision you make. Once you make the decision, like you decide like, okay, drum rack is how I make drums, and you start doing that over and over and over and over again, even if you didn't mean to, like you've just trained that in to your subconscious, and now you don't have access to it. And now until something in your life or something in your process or someone you know brings it to your attention, there's a very good chance you will never even consider the fact that there's other ways of doing that. And you'll just kind of lock into the idea that like, oh, drums are this. And that's natural, but you could see how this becomes problematic. Like they eventually become the limiting factor on top of diminishing returns, which is that you have all of this information and you just keep adding information into this giant pile of things you know. And then your brain gravitates towards either novel information or the most deeply trained information. And so because of that, your brain is either going after the things you'd have no control over that you've trained in long ago, or it's going after just like some stuff that you've thought about recently, which again is not bad, but it means that it's not necessarily relevant to what you're doing in this project file right now at this moment. What you are interested in or have learned or come across in your life recently is in some essence random, right? Like it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what you want to do in a moment in a DAW. So we run into this problem where like your brain is automatically making all of these decisions that aren't necessarily relevant to your growth or to do something bold or different or interesting. You're just kind of recycling things that have already happened many times. Like this is kind of the ultimate result of this. And then this is where we get to talk about these two different. So now I'll have to go back past diminishing returns to this. Okay, so we're going to use this framework. Now we've talked about habits and diminishing returns. We've kind of identified the problem. And now I want to take that a step further and identify like two different ways of thinking. And this is like kind of an arbitrary separation because I don't know, like this isn't based in like science or anything. This is something I made up, but it's based on observations from, again, teaching over the last 10 years and seeing people hitting this same roadblock over and over and over again and not really being able to pin down exactly why people aren't able to overcome it. And a lot of like the earlier teaching I was doing, it would be, oh, well, this guy just like needs to make some bass sounds and stick them in there. So like, let's just make these bass sounds. We'll teach you how to do all the sounds you want. And then you should be able to just do it. And the problem was never about that technical information. It was all about the approach. It was all about how people are thinking about what they're doing going in. Before they even make any decisions, there's already so many decisions being made because of the subconscious brain. Like that is the thing that's getting people. It's you reach diminishing returns and then your habits limit you and you don't have control over your habits. And so you start to repetitively make decisions that aren't actually leading you to growth anymore, and you kind of level off. And this is natural in every single skill and not unique to music at all. But I think the nuance here is that it's a creative medium, right? Like there's no like objective measure of how well you're doing. The only measure of how well you're doing is your own measure. And so when people just aren't happy with their own results, but there's no other way to know like what they're doing, what am I missing here? Like it becomes challenging to figure out what to do, like what to change. And I didn't really know how to help people with that for the longest time. And I didn't even know how to help myself with that for the longest time because I went through this same process of thinking I just needed to know more stuff and then not really knowing what to do with that once I did. So now let's take a look at this kind of dichotomy here, the productive versus the creative brain. And again, kind of an arbitrary separation here, but I think a lot of people will resonate with at least the productive brain, which is to me what most people default to. This is the way of thinking that I think is very natural and also encouraged by like most of the way education is online and in music schools. Like this makes sense to me. So I understand why people use their productive brain to attempt to create music. So a productive session seeks a tangible result. It's going in to your DAW or whatever with the intention of getting something out at the end. And that could be, a sample or a sound design session that you're going to use in something later. It could be starting a song. It could be working on another track. But at the end of that session, you want to have something to show for it. It could even be like a preset that you could use for something later. But you're looking for a result. You're not looking to just spend some time playing around. This is about making progress towards your goals. And usually these goals involve like some iterative improvement. So like, okay, I want to work on this track. I want it to be better than my last track. Like I want this track to like be closer to my overall thing. The idea of what I'm trying to create in my head. I want this to be an iteration closer to that. And oftentimes it goes way further than that even. And it's more like, I want to write my best piece of music ever, and I want it to be in the style of my favorite artist, and I want it to have XYZ properties, and I want it so that I can get involved with this label, so I can get the attention of like this guy, so I can get this booking on this show. Like it just goes on and on and on and on. There are so many external pressures involved with writing music. Some of them negative, but a lot of them positive. Like I think there's something genuinely good about wanting to be involved in the music community, about like having respect for people and like wanting that respect to be reciprocated for something you created. Like that's a healthy motivator. And I think the way people perceive themselves in these communities that they want to be a part of is a huge factor in this. Like there's this desire to be involved and validated and perceived a specific way. And that isn't a bad thing. Like that's why people release music, right? Like we all have an identity that we're expressing through this, and that's good. And it's good to want that. So these are negative things. But going in with this mindset of like, I want this to be my best work. I want this to be like my favorite song and my favorite style written by my favorite artist. Like that mindset is what triggers the problems from here, right? So what does your brain do when you say, I want to write my best piece of music? Well, it's going to automatically filter through your subconscious and say, okay, well, we want to make something good. So what are we the best at? Well, the things you're the best at are just your deepest trained habits, the things you already know the most about, have already used the most, have already seen to have success in the most contexts. Those are the things your brain is always, that's training, right? Like you've practiced those things. And so your brain is going to subconsciously lean into them. So what happens is you go to make your best music. And so your best music involves all of the safest, most trained, already used, least novel habits in your habitual space, like naturally. And it makes sense because you want to do the things you're good at in order to make something good. But very quickly you can see the problem of how you stop learning from the process because you essentially are just doing the same thing over and over and over again. And even if you're experimenting a little bit, which people almost always are, there's this set of habits that is the same every time, and it's pretty big. But then there's this small threshold where people will experiment on top of this established habit set. And this experimentation can exist, but you never want to experiment too much because too much experimentation always comes with the risk of compromising the end result. And the productive recession is all about that end result. We want a good result. And so if you're afraid of that result not being good, then you really subconsciously, out of your control, you will limit the amount of experimentation you're willing to embark on, because experimentation is implicitly involves imperfection and moments that aren't necessarily what you're trying to achieve. It involves kind of cutting through some garbage sounds sometimes. It involves like maybe doing something that doesn't make any sense, but then committing and seeing it through and finding something on the other side. And doing all of that to an idea that is in your own mind like 70% towards this goal that you already have, you just won't do it because it compromises the entire identity and idea of what you're going for, potentially. Even if that experimentation would be the answer, you will avoid it. And so, what all of this leads to is that a productive brain is a habitual brain. To be productive means you are recalling on habits efficiently. And again, this isn't inherently bad. Like it doesn't mean you should never use habits or that it's an inherently bad thing to call on habitual processes while you're writing music. In fact, you don't have a choice. Like it's going to happen. The problem is that when you allow this instinct to overtake your whole process, which only happens at an intermediate level once you have enough experience to actually create habits around every little piece of it. Once that happens, you are limiting your growth. You're limiting your ability to actually learn past that from the process itself. Whereas before, the process used to teach you an insane amount every time, because every time you do it, you'd find a new thing that was completely new and changed the whole set of options for you, and etc. So productive brain, while it has this caveat of like at a certain point it slows your learning, even if it never stops, you will still iterate a little bit, but it slows it down significantly, with the trade-off being you actually finish music and release it and like strive towards these goals of like, you know, getting stuff out and getting people to hear it and like playing shows and releasing on labels or whatever it is that you want to do. Maybe it's none of those things. Maybe it's just to do it for yourself. It really doesn't matter. Like whatever is motivating you, you can actually accomplish that through leaning into what you're good at, using your habits and pushing in towards that goal, you know? Like that's how most people think about doing it. And honestly, it makes sense. Like if I want to get good at something, why don't I just keep trying to do that until I eventually figure it out? And you will. It just takes an insanely long time to do it that way. And the reason is, oh, okay, we'll get into the reason in a second when we go over creative brain. But this drawback of like you stop learning as much is traded off for the idea that you actually make progress towards these external goals and careers and inspirations and influences and identity expression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not bad. We don't need to treat this like our enemy. We just need to be aware that like, while this is the thing that allows for all this efficiency and allows us to move forward, it comes with this giant caveat of it hinders learning. And then people come to me and they're like, well, what am I doing wrong? And I spent years being like, okay, well, let's figure out like the part in your process that is wrong and fix it. But that's just doing the same, like, you have to actually address everything you're doing at a low level and reconsider it if you want to make huge gains in learning again. And this is where the creative brain comes in. So a creative session is specifically not worried about the result. A creative session is all about going in wanting to do two things. You need to learn something new, and you need to enjoy the process. And as long as those two things are happening, then you had a successful creative session. The end result can be thrown away every single time. It's fine. Doesn't matter. You don't care about it. And this fundamental difference has a huge cognitive shift on how you think about what you're doing. Because risk is no longer a factor. There is no risk in a creative session because there's no product to compromise. So by being in a creative mindset, you have basically opened up your subconscious to the idea that you no longer have to use extremely rigid habits. You can actually do anything you want. And then further, we're going to do an exercise that forces you to do things that are specifically outside of your habits. But the whole idea with a creative session generally, whether you're doing that exercise or just thinking about it as a general mindset. The whole idea is just you don't care about the result. You only care about having fun and learning something. And when I say learning something, I just mean trying something you haven't done before, finding a thing that hasn't like been part of your normal experience for however long you've been making music. Just anything. And like that might sound difficult, but there's nothing easier because there are so many things to know about and to try. And it really doesn't take long to, if you really think about it, to find something that you have truly never done and try it. And, you know, chances are a lot of those things don't lead anywhere. And that's okay. Like if it sucks, it sucks. And I think part of enjoying the process is like enjoying making something that sucks. And like worst case, it can be funny. If it really sucks, then it's usually just funny. But you know, once in a while you're doing this, you'll start to hit on things that you would never find in your regular sessions. And these are the things that can make all the difference in how you perceive music production. Like the problems people face are not one dimensional. I can't be like, oh, this is what's wrong. Here's how you fix it. It's like a whole perspective issue. And so when you start to look at things through this perspective of the result is not what matters, the process is what matters, that completely changes the way that you interface with the software and the way you make risks and try things and just the way you write in general. And I think both come with huge benefits and huge costs. With the creative brain, if you never care about the result, chances are you're never going to care about releasing or, you know, and there's tons of people like this, like people who are just super into like modular gear and have like a $10 zillion worth of hardware synths, and all they do is just sit and play with it, and they never record it, they never show anyone, they just love to play with it, man. I'm like, that's purely creative. There's nothing, there is no product, there is no end result. It's literally just about doing it. And I love that. Like, all respect to that. If that's what you're doing, you probably don't even need a tutorial, right? Because there's no, unless you're just trying to figure out how your setup works, like realistically, you don't care. You're just there to play with it. It's a toy. And like, I think that's an awesome mindset to have, and something that people who take making music super seriously need to understand, is that like that playfulness and that like lack of caring is educational. It's where you learn. Like that mentality and that ethos is adopted by so many people who are perceived as like these super technical geniuses. Like you talk to them and they're just like some really normal dude who's just like completely winging it, having a good time. Like I can't tell you how many times I've had that experience. And I think people even imbue this on me, and it's like they realize that my process is me just completely winging it and not really thinking about it that hard. And to understand that is to understand that like this isn't about conceiving of something specific and then stepping back and being like, here's how I will execute my master plan, and like writing a whole song in one go exactly as you saw it. Like most of what you're hearing in music in general is people experimenting and then finding things through that process and then leaning into the things that they find that speak to them. And it's way less of like this external, like forcing a thing to be exactly the way you see it. It's more like all of that is already in there. You just have to find what you connect with. And the sounds themselves are like pretty ambiguous and don't really matter. It's like you can breathe whatever kind of life you want into them. So this is productive versus creative brain. And just to summarize the benefits and because again, we need both of these things. I think everybody has, it's like a gradient, and everyone exists somewhere between these two things, right? And a lot of the people I get are like leaning super far on this end and are super motivated. And it's not like they aren't trying, like they're spending tons of time trying to get these results that they can't get to. And I think the answer for these people, and I'm sure it's biased because like a lot of people who seek lessons are going to be on this side instead of this side. Because again, what do you need a tutorial for if you don't care what the end result is? Like, But even with that bias aside, I think people who are viewing this type of information now, like if you're watching this and you feel like you're struggling getting the results you're looking for, there's a good chance you need to take a lot of hints from this way of thinking, this ethos of creation, which is just to ignore results and focus on learning and experimenting and having fun. And through this, I have created like a concrete exercise that I think allows people who are stuck in productive brain to utilize this way of thinking in a very like regimented, specific way that will force you to train out this idea of like, I'm just reliant on this habit set plus a tiny amount of experimentation. We want to if you give yourself like a period of time every day, like an hour a day of being 100% in this zone just to balance this out, you will notice how much it affects your productive sessions, even when you aren't thinking about it and you're just allowing your subconscious to kind of take the wheel in your decision making. This is affecting your subconscious. And we'll talk about how this is actually retraining your brain in a bunch of specific ways and how that has above anything else I've been able to teach anybody, any technique, any of that shit. This exercise, the people who do it and take it seriously and actually enjoy it and get something out of it, every single time see vast improvement. And it's the only thing I've ever found that is like that. Everything else, it's like sometimes there's a guy who I'm like, oh, this guy maybe just needs to know how to make this sound. And then I show him that. And then he seems perfectly happy. And then the music he makes is like, sounds good to me. And so that's a great exchange. But there's so many cases where I've done that and it's failed. The only times I've done this and it's failed are when people just don't do it and they have nothing to show when they come back. Like, you need to be doing this exercise regularly and taking it seriously. It's like guitar. Like I had the same shit when I was a kid. I started playing guitar when I was really young, and I'd go every week. But I just didn't. I wasn't interested in practicing it. Like it just seemed like work to me. I just didn't care enough. And so every week I'd show up to that lesson, and my teacher would be like, "Okay, well, are you ready to move on to the next thing?" And I'd be like, "Not really. I didn't really get enough time to like practice what you showed me last time." And then he'd be like, "Okay, so now we're gonna sit here for an hour, and we're gonna practice together, and I'm gonna show you all the things you should have been doing on your own time." And like being on the other end of that, you start to realize that this is entirely in the other person's hands. Like, as much as I want to think I can just imbue production onto you, whoever you are, I can't do that. Like, I literally can't. There's no way to transfer this type of skill. It's a non-transferable skill. And it's because I don't know how the hell I do anything either. It's all subconscious also for the most part. And while I can retroactively go back and like consciously explain how I knew something or why I did something or like how I got the idea for something, all of that came from, you know, an earlier set of habits and experiences. And like, there's no way for me to really put together all of the things that had to happen for me to know like, oh, when I heard this sound, it gave me this idea and I added this effect to it. It's like, that's innate to me in a way that I can't give to you. And even if I show you exactly how I did it, it doesn't mean that in that moment you will think to have the same idea. In fact, you definitely won't, because no two people will. So you have to accept that like there's no way to actually get this information from listening to people talk or from watching videos over and over. And there's an there's kind of an incentive in, and I don't think people are necessarily doing this consciously, but there's an incentive in music education to not make you aware of this fact, because ultimately if I do my job well, you don't need me for anything, and there's no reason for you to subscribe to my website and do all of these things, right? But this is the dirty secret that nobody wants you to know, is that like none of these tutorials mean shit, and actually what matters is if you show up every day and spend some time in a creative mindset and actually figure some stuff out for yourself and then apply it in your own music confidently. And if you don't do that, then nothing else means anything. And the people who spend the most money on this type of shit are the people who will never make that realization. Um, and it's a weird thing as an educator to be in this position of like knowing that the person is never going to actually take the initiative to do it themselves because they think they can pay their way out of it. Um, and you just can't. Like, no amount of money, no amount of YouTube, no amount of private lessons, no amount of anything will change it. The only thing that matters is whether you actually sit down and be creative. And if you do it a lot, like a lot. Um, and I think one of the reasons that you see that like kids are really good at this, and it's the same reason that I'm good at this, is because I started young. And I had nothing but time to sit and figure this out just for fun. And I think a lot of people are like in a position in life where they literally don't have the time to do it, or they don't make the time to do it because it's not actually a priority in the way that they say it is. Like it's really something that they want the skill, but they don't want to do the work that's required to get the skill. And if you're in that situation, like until AI comes and makes all of this shit super easy, you're kind of just screwed. And um, I don't I don't even mean to sidebar this and go on this whole rant, but like the reality is that it's good news and bad news. The bad news is that I can't just hand you all of the answers. But the good news is that what this means is that you literally contain all of the answers to all your own problems within your own process for the most part. There's like a few things where, yeah, it obviously helps to like know other people and like learn some technical, like actual, like objective, factual based information about the software and about what you're doing. But beyond that, it's like really the whole thing is you, whoever you are. You are the own answer to your own problems. Like I can't do anything about that. And I've tried like countless times. I've spent tens of hours with individual people, like specifically trying to imbue my skills onto them. And that was an early lesson I had to learn as an educator, that is just not a thing. Unfortunately and fortunately. And so with all of that said, here's the exercise. I'm like, this is, if you're still watching this and still listening to me talk right now, this is the most important thing I can tell you. And if you do this, there's a good chance it could change everything for you. So let's go. Where is this? Yeah, here it is. Yeah, let's make sure I did a good job. Did we go? Yeah, we did all, we're way past all of that. Okay, so here's the exercise. You're going to set a timer on your phone or your computer or whatever for an hour, and that's important. Then you're going to ask yourself, what do I always do? What do I never do? And what do I suck at? You're going to make a rule set based off of your responses, which I'll explain what that means. It's basically using what I call creative subversions to specifically make these questions all relevant to your habit space. But we'll go through it. Then you start the timer and then make music based on the rules you create. It's just a creative exercise for 1 hour. Then the timer goes off. You're going to ask yourself 3 more questions. Did I learn something? Did I enjoy it? Do I like the thing that I made? And now we're going to go through all of these questions one at a time because all of these are very specifically curated to address all of the shit that we were just talking about. And I think if you internalize all of this and actually do it, like, this is the sauce. So, what do I always do? This is your habits, right? This is you just asking yourself, what are my habits? And if you don't know the answer to this question, just start doing stuff, you know? Start a song. How would you start a song, you know? Answer that question for yourself. And you'll very quickly realize, like, oh, well, like, I reach for this, and I usually, like, start by, you know, I make a loop out of a kick and a snare, or I put a chord down, or whatever. People start from different places. But for you, it's going to be something specific. And it doesn't have to be like, yeah, obviously everyone switches things up a little bit every time they do something, but you will find consistencies, I promise. Maybe it's you always write in 4/4. You always use your right hand on the mouse. You always use a DAW. You always get your kicks from the same place. Like it could be anything. Um, Literally any part of your process that you find to be consistent. And it could be something physical in the real world. It could be something in Ableton. It could be something abstract about the way you think about music. It could be anything. Just find something consistent and write it down. And this is basically gonna put you in a state where, I mean, think about it. So if we always write in 4/4 with our right hand, and we're always using a DAW, we can subvert all of these things. So this is what a creative subversion is. So this is basically saying, here's my habits. I do these things. How do I not do these things? And we can answer this question basically any number of ways, and like the amount of creativity you use in answering this question determines what your rule set will be, and in turn what the whole process will be. So answering these is kind of the game we're playing, and the easiest way to subvert an always question is just to get rid of the thing. So if you always write in 4/4, get rid of the time signature. No time signature, no grid. You always use your mouse with your right hand, no mouse. Or no hands. You always write using a DAW. Okay, now you have to use some other shit to make this. Maybe you have to use something in real life. Maybe you have to like record it onto your phone or something, like every element one at a time. Or maybe you have to like, just write a song on an instrument. Or maybe you gotta like use like After Effects or some other software that's not really meant to use to be used as a DAW, but still lets you load VSTs and shit. Anything. So a creative subversion is just take your response and then change it somehow, turn it on its head. And just getting rid of it is easy, but you could also do this. You could change it in whatever way you want. So another example would be like, okay, we'll use an insane time signature then. We'll write in 15/3, and then we'll use the mouse with our left hand, and then write using DAW. Yeah, that could be like use After Effects instead of a DAW, or like Audacity or whatever you want. Or get kicks from one sample pack. It could be like, okay, I'm not allowed to get kicks from a sample pack at all, would be get rid of it. Or I got to get my kicks from any sample pack but that one, would be subverting it in a different way. So using creative subversions, we're going to create these rule sets. So any of those things I just said, like that are counter to these existing, all of this, we can use as a rule. We'll just write this big list and we'll combine the rules later. So what do I never do? Let's go over this. What do I never do is less it's less the things you avoid and more of just like things you would never think to do in a regular session. Like make a rule. Make the most insane rule you can possibly make. And this can be anything. Like you can go meta with it and go like, oh, I want to like, turn my speakers upside down, or like produce facing away from the computer, or like it could be I never make this genre of music, or like I would never like have the tempo always be changing, or whatever. Literally anything. Like think about something insane that you could do but doesn't really make any sense to do, and then write it down. And the things you never do should be an infinitely longer list than the things you have done or would do, because that's basically everything, right? Like all of us are making a very, very small fraction of what is possible. So when you think about what you never do, it's like, well, I can sit here all day and list things I never touch or think about in Ableton. And I've done this exercise plenty of times, but there's always more. There's always more things you haven't tried. And again, this is a game. Like you are trying to make this fun for yourself. So when you're thinking of these, realize you're going to have to use them. So don't do shit that's too annoying. But also realize that you are training yourself right now. As you do this is a skill also. You are using your creative brain, right? Like you are actually coming up with something where like the end result of this doesn't really matter either. You're just making some random list of things. But this is getting you in the habit of just like always thinking of what is possible, always thinking of what you're doing on a regular basis and how to subvert it. Like keeping your brain open to the idea of doing new things, but then also keeping your brain very aware of the things that it is used to and relying on constantly. And as long as you're hyper aware of both of these things, you start opening up way more conscious decision making in your process. So that's what do I never do. We got these random examples. I gave you a ton of examples, but there you go. There's some more examples. What do I suck at? Now, this is what you avoid. These are anti-habits. What you suck at are the things you've probably spent the least time on, the things you've built the least habits around, the things you struggle with the most. So this could be I suck at writing chords. This could be like I suck at finishing music. This could be like I suck at writing fast. I suck at making things in this tempo. I suck at drums. I suck at whatever. Could be anything. Literally anything. And again, the list of things you suck at should be like way, way, way longer than the list of things you're good at. And you shouldn't feel bad. Like this isn't to make you feel bad about yourself. This is to make you realize that like, oh, there's just like way too many things. And again, knowing a little bit about as many of those things as possible is super helpful. So take like, okay, I suck at writing chords. Like say you don't make music that like relies on chords that often. So you just like don't really know how to do it. You kind of suck at it. Well, you have identified an area where you can find some exponential learning. If you don't know anything about chords, go learn some super basic music theory and you will learn an insane amount about writing chords just from that because you don't know much about it, right? So like identifying these things that you avoid will very quickly identify things that lead to exponential learning because they're outside of your habit space. And those are the things that you A, probably need to practice, but B, probably haven't spent much time thinking about. And usually it's because it seems intimidating or complicated. But because of that, because you've avoided it, you've actually created an opportunity for yourself to very easily learn something new that will probably actually be valuable. So finding things you suck at, even if they're not that interesting to you, like even if you don't give a damn about music theory, spending an hour learning about it is actually probably a huge benefit over just ignoring it entirely. And having that hour of information, even if you ignore it from then on out, is still way more than knowing nothing, like way more. So you're always better off having like a little bit of knowledge than being at actual ground zero or like really, really low in information on something. So just kind of like build your skill tree wide. And that's what all of this is about. Like finding the things you're already doing a ton, finding things you're avoiding constantly, and then finding things that you would just generally never think of, and forcing yourself to like pull a new idea out of the void. Those are the points of these questions. And through doing that, we're constantly addressing this habitual space. We're actually doing something about this problem of, okay, I've reached limited learning and now I need to find new ways of creating that address my habits and force me to do something different. So these questions will find your habits, find your non-habits, force you to do something with both of those things, and then also encourage you to invent a rule on top of that. And through this, we'll end up, uh, you know, making some crazy combination of things. So like an example rule set, make psytrance, drums must have 10 effects each, 2 minutes in length, mega chords. So this addresses all of these different potential deficits. So like 2 minutes in length, if you struggle making a whole song, you now have an hour to make a 2-minute song. And this is going to force you, to actually, you have to factor that in. If I'm going to successfully make something 2 minutes long, I now have to optimize a bunch of things about this process so that I can just immediately create a bunch of song very quickly. And that's going to have you thinking very differently than if there was no minimum length. That would create a situation where you can just zoom in and think about the details and take your time more.
But both of these things have value, right? So it's like um, identifying all these different things and then creating a wacky rule set. Now you're going to spend this hour making some really weird psytrance that's 2 minutes long, super over processed, and has a bunch of chords on it. And like for me, I don't know how to do any of this. I mean, other than drums with the 10 effects, that sounds easy, but like I don't know how the hell to make psytrance. I don't know what mega chords means. I'm really not good at making something 2 minutes long in an hour. So this would be hard for me. But that's the whole point, right? Like now when I go to do this, I have no habits built around making psytrance. I actually genuinely don't know how they do a lot of it. So like now I have to sit down and figure that out, right? And it probably has nothing to do with a lot of the things I want to do in my day-to-day music, but I guarantee you there's aspects of that design process and that ethos and that sort of genre set that are super interesting and would absolutely apply in the right context if I was using it. So it's like forcing myself into this place where I can't use the genres I'm familiar with as a crutch to inform my decision making. And I actually now have to consciously figure out what makes psytrance. And I don't know. And it's a little puzzle I have to solve for myself. This is very conscious thinking. I can't automate any process of this with my brain because my brain doesn't have anything to give me. It's really up to me to kind of navigate this in real time. And that's what all of this is about, is forcing yourself into a state that's removed from subconscious automation and back into this real time conscious improvisation. That's what it's all about. When you're improvising real time, you're here. You're not your subconscious mind is no longer at the wheel, and suddenly all of these things that used to be predetermined are suddenly these branches of different decisions you can make, where as before you would just start the song and not even think about it. Now it's like you'll start taking into consideration things like the time signature and the key and the length and what type of processing is on the master and like what tempo you're using and whether there's tempo automations and like the colors you use in the clips. Like everything, every single thing you'll realize matters and should be considered and could have potential implications for the overall sound of the song or whatever you're making. And so being aware of that and then constantly creating new contexts is going to create a bunch of good situations. We're going to get into why all of this actually matters later. I want to keep going on with these questions before we get too far into this, because we also have the follow-up questions, which I think are super important. So obviously we're going to go ahead and do all of the primary questions. We're going to do the actual activity. We're going to sit down and do the hour of whatever rule set, actually writing that piece of music. Then the timer is going to go off. And this is why the timer is important, because we need to do these follow-ups. So the follow-ups, again, it's got to be a creative session. Did I learn or try something new? If you did, sweet. That's great. You did it successfully. And now you should acknowledge that and maybe think about like, yeah, what was sick about this? Like, why did I like it? And it's as easy as that, because what you're trying to do there is be like, oh, I stumbled across some interesting thing. I want to remember that. And then your brain, if you're like, yes, that was stimulating, I really enjoyed that. And then you go back and reflect and you're like, brain, remember that time that we did that and it was really sick. That's how you create habits, right? So you're doing this with the hope of your subconscious mind actually internalizing that information to some extent. So if yes, you're pretty much good to go. If no, it's still really valuable because, again, you are the one making this. Like, I wish I could just prescribe this activity to people, but you have to be the one who determines whether this is fun, this is something you learn from, it's something you feel it's worth doing. Like, all of that is determined by the rule sets you create for yourself. And so you have to know whether or not it's actually working. And that's what this check is for. And if not, then that means you should change something. And a lot of times, if you're not having fun or you're not learning anything, or sorry, if you're not learning or trying anything, because we're going to address having fun in the next one. But learning or trying something new, if you're not doing either of those things, then it probably means that your prompts are too conservative. Like you probably didn't push it far enough. Or maybe you pushed it too far and it was just too hard to actually get anything accomplished. So you didn't learn anything really. You just like struggled the whole time. So there really is this sweet spot about like how absurd the rules are and how attainable it actually is to operate within them. And making these rules, again, is as much a part of the process as the process itself. So you really want to make sure that when you're doing this, you actually think about like, okay, am I successfully getting something out of this? Did I actually break new ground? Did I actually try something new? Or did I somehow manage to revert back to my habits? Or was it so far outside of my habits that I literally just couldn't get anything done? And if either of those things are true, that means you got to recalibrate the prompts. And it means you got to think to yourself, how do I make this more enjoyable and something that I can actually work through? And it's the same idea for did I enjoy the process? Like, obviously, if you had fun, think about what you had fun doing and you're good. And you just want to give that like a little dopamine fix of like, I liked doing this part because it sounded crazy. Great. If not, again, why didn't you like it? Sometimes you'll learn something, but you hate doing it. And that's a problem too, because if you don't like it, you won't retain it. It's the same problem. So this is why people don't practice guitar. So you have to find a way to make this interesting for yourself. And there's no, again, you're making the rules. So there's actually nothing that says you can't change parameters here to make it more enjoyable for yourself. So figure out what made it prohibitive in terms of enjoyment. Was it too easy or too hard is basically what that means. If it's too easy, again, your prompts are too conservative. If it's too hard, you probably went a little too off the rails and made something that is like too hard to actually do anything with. And this is all to taste. Like, I can't answer any of this for you. This is purely subjective, but just realize that if it's not working and the answer to either of these questions is no, then you got to change something. And I can't really tell you what, but I can tell you it probably has to do with one of those things. And then the last question, this is different. And this is like why the timer is super important, because when you start that timer, you are entering a sacred space. That 1 hour is purely creative. You do not care about the result. You're not allowed to care about the result. It's very much part of it that you assume that everything you make in that session will be scrapped or lost at the end, and you don't care about that. Total detachment. And once that timer goes off, this question is where you get to decide if that changes. So if you like it, you can retroactively decide like, okay, now what? Am I going to take the rules off and work on it like a normal song and shift it over to my productive brain to just finish it? Do I keep the rules on and just keep working on it because I'm enjoying this? Do I compromise the rules in some way and maybe get rid of some part of it because it led somewhere interesting, but I don't love like all the restriction? Like you get to decide whatever you want to do with this. Maybe you just delete it. Maybe you actually like it and you want to hold on to it. Maybe you just throw it in a folder somewhere and we'll maybe open it one day again. Maybe you stem it for parts because you made some cool sounds and you want to put those sounds in a new project. It really doesn't matter what you do to this song, but if you like it, you're allowed to use it for whatever you want. Just not until that hour ends. In that hour, you are not committed to it. And it's that sound of the timer is like you deciding like, okay, is what I'm doing a waste of time beyond the idea of learning and having fun? Because if it is, you can keep learning and having fun, but you don't necessarily have to. And with this activity, it's like the minimum is an hour a day, but the longer you spend in this mindset doing this type of stuff, the more returns you'll gain in terms of learning and actually finding new ground. So yeah, if you want to spend another hour, just re-up the hour with these rules. That's also totally fine. Or maybe just go forever indefinitely with those rules. Maybe those rules are just assigned to that project indefinitely now. It doesn't matter. However you see fit, is what you get to do to this tune. Just remember that before that timer goes off, you don't have any say. You assume it's dead in the water. And a lot of times it still will be. Like you'll finish it and you'll be like, what the hell is this? And you'll just get rid of it. And that's fine. Uh, in fact, yeah, you're not even trying to assess the quality of it. You basically are just like, if you don't care about this, get it out of there. Like it's totally fine to delete it. You don't need it for anything. So don't feel guilty. Just realize like that's the name of the game. You're gonna make some stankers, and it's really not even. A lot of times, like the sound has nothing to do with what you were trying to accomplish. You're just trying to like figure out how to do something, and the sound is just some like random result that doesn't matter that much. So decide the fate of your thing. Do whatever you want with it. If you want to get rid of it, don't feel bad about it. If you want to keep it, fine, but realize you're only allowed to feel that way after the hour. That's most of the main important stuff. This is now like with all of that laid out, these are like the last like soft rules of this whole practice of creative subversions, because I think I've noticed some things that people tend to do or not do that end up hurting them a little bit. So the first thing is to actually write all of this down. You don't have to do that, but I think it makes a huge difference if you actually take the time to slowly go through and write them down, or at least type it, and really think about each of these responses deeply and not just like do it off the cuff. The second thing is to actually do this every single time. So a lot of people, when I give them this, they'll want to send and like answer these questions 40 different ways and write it all down and then come back to that list every day and just make new permutations. And like, again, that's not technically wrong. Like you can do this however you want, as long as you're doing it. I think you're better off than not. But realistically, to me, making those rules is as important as doing the exercise, because you are training a part of your brain that is identifying habit structures and breaking them. And then also you're training a part of your brain that's just generating new ideas for things to try. And you should be doing that every day. Also, your habits as you do this are going to shift. So you'll start finding things that maybe won't replace your old processes, but will start to be used in tandem with old processes as you discover them. And when that happens, you can't really answer, oh, well, this is something I always do now, because you found something new. Like your whole process will change. Even if you weren't doing this, your whole process would change. So since you are dynamic and everything you do is constantly changing, all of these answers should be dynamic and constantly changing. And so I think trying to pre-batch all of the responses is actually a no-go, and you're way better off like sitting down and doing this whole thing start to finish, like with a piece of paper, and answering it new with new results every single time. Also, people are tempted to just be like, oh, I suck at sound design, I'll just make sounds for an hour. And I think realistically, this should all be around making music for the most part, or at least mostly around making music, because again, that's all that matters at the end. Like the sounds and the technical details really like aren't that useful towards making music at the end of the day. It's like what actually sets you apart as a producer is like how you compose and how you contextualize all of these elements together. So the other part of this whole thing is that we are in the ideas phase. We are training how to identify all of these things and how to make our brain like more open to creating ideas and being versatile in that way. But then when we're actually doing the process, we are training our brains to create and arrange within any context of sound. So you put yourself in a really crazy corner and you force yourself to find a way out of it. And when we're doing that in the context of writing a piece of music or a little song or a little motif or a little idea, what you're actually training there is just a general ideas machine. And this is the other part of what we're doing here, is it's really not just about fighting your habits. It's also about creating a new habit that is centered around creation. It's centered around this idea of like, give me any set of sounds and any rule set, and I can make you something interesting with it. And if you're in that situation, you can do anything because that's all that music is. Take this rule set, take these sounds, make something. That's how we're doing it. That's what a genre is, right? Like the genre informs the sounds and the tempo and the style and this sort of like aesthetic and vibe of the whole thing. And then from there, you just make some sounds and then arrange them in that style. Like that's really all it is. And so getting good at that is actually more important than getting good at anything else. And it all starts with getting out of this like habitual bog and starting to get into this position of like every time I can sit down and try something new. And once you're doing that every day, something new will is just like an infinite resource. Like, okay, I'm in this song, I'm kind of bored of it. I don't know what I don't like about it. I need it to change. I need to do something new. Instead of that being a roadblock, it's now just like part of your regular process of like, okay, now I can immediately think off the cuff. Here's like 10 ways I could completely switch up the entire vibe of what's going on here and take it in a different direction that's probably more interesting. And that's really the only skill there is like having the intuition of like how to change the composition to be more compelling. And what we're doing here is creating ideas over and over and over again in the most absurd circumstances. So center those ideas around arrangement, center it around music, because that's what we're trying to do. Don't allow too many of these sessions to be like partial, like, oh, I'm going to only do this part of making music. Like you want to really at least incorporate arranging the sounds that you're creating in some way. And that's that. And I guess, yeah. So we already went over this too. Goal is to train your ability to come up with and execute new ideas. And then, yeah, 1 hour a day minimum, if you can, or more, as much time as you really want to spend doing it. But the hour a day thing, I mean, this goes back to like, if you want to learn anything, your teacher is going to tell you to do this an hour a day if you can. Like that sort of training is what makes all of the difference. And I think there's a lot of people who are putting, Jesus, I just hit the mic really hard. Sorry. I think there's a lot of people who are putting these hours in, like way more than an hour a day, but the types of hours they're putting in aren't very useful. So now you have a very concrete thing to use to do practice, creative practice. And I think this resource allows people to have some very specific direction to go with music at any skill level. Like this is a path forward for you no matter what. And it comes entirely from you and doesn't require any external resources or knowledge or anything. It just requires that you sit down and genuinely try to do this in a way that's engaging for yourself. And I believe, yeah, I mean, we nailed it. This is it. We went through all of it. So, yeah, guys, I think realistically, I don't have much else to say about this first module. Like this is really like the most beneficial thing, as I've said, for people as I've been teaching for all of these years. Like I have seen people completely 180 their whole, like all of their creative problems go away when they start actually doing this. And I can't guarantee you that, but you know, I think there's no way that this doesn't help people. And I think it's infinitely more useful than like how to make a bass sound or whatever. So I hope this actually does something for you guys. And thank you for sitting through all of that. If you made it here, I really appreciate it. I'm going to take a second to plug all the stuff I'm doing, of course. First of all, this is written out in this document. I have all of this written in a much more probably articulate manner. I'm going to make this available in some way as just like the definitive document of all this information. And I will put that up for free as well. feel free to distribute that at your leisure. I really want people to be aware of this. And then also, this is an open conversation. Like, I would love to hear how this goes for you guys, if it's actually useful, any tweaks you think might be made, any sort of anything. Like, I'm constantly looking for feedback from people who are learning. It's been a very long time since I was just on YouTube trying to figure this stuff out, and I think it's really different now. So hearing feedback from you guys is awesome. Feel free to come join my Discord. You can also become a member on my website at frequent.audio. You can become a free member there too. If you become a free member, you'll automatically get added to the Discord and you'll get a free member role. I'm going to be dropping free videos and stuff on YouTube still. And in the Discord, I'll be doing, free members get a bunch of stuff as well. And you can come hang out and I'll be in there chatting in general chat, doing that whole thing. And then if you're interested in subscribing, this will be kind of the format, me just kind of ranting with these longer form lectures. And again, like I said at the beginning, you can pay the higher tier and actually attend these real time. I'll do Q&As kind of at this point now is when I'd be doing Q&A, and you can ask me anything you want. You can write down your questions as we're going through. And then the lower tier members, you just get a recording of this. And then everything past here is going to be through the subscription. So this will be the only SCS that's available to everyone. And then next time, just so you guys know what's coming up, we're going to be doing, it's all technical. So we're going to be getting into like psychoacoustics and FFT and delay and phase cancellation and all of these sort of lower level things that we're going to build on. And then again, the end goal of all of this is like I was saying before, we eventually stop talking about super technical stuff, and all of this opens up into a very free form arrangement driven series where every couple weeks, I haven't actually figured out exactly the interval. It really depends on when I'm touring and stuff, but I will be in the Discord as often as I can doing these courses. And by the end of it, it's going to be way less of these scripted things and way more of like a community engaged thing where I will be kind of doing these sort of challenges in real time and making stuff with you guys in real time and actually interacting with people in real time and having new things to talk about related to creativity that aren't necessarily just like these very mechanical, like here's how you get better at music, but more just talking about art and the creative process in general and sharing music with each other and doing all these things. It's all going to be happening in the Forge Discord. Yeah. Whew. I think that's it. I think we got that first take, which is pretty crazy. But yeah, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you tuning in. I'll see you over in the Forge Discord. Subscribe online. I love you. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.